the next now concerning, you've got an advancement to the next question, so to speak. Chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the matters about which he wrote, and he deals with some issues there about marriage. Verse 25, same chapter, now concerning the betrothed. In chapter 8, verse 1, now concerning food offered to idols. In chapter 12, verse 1, now concerning spiritual gifts. Chapter 16 in verse 1, now concerning the collection for the saints. And so each time he is addressing another question that has come up, and he's answering written correspondence, and he's writing back and giving an apostolic answer to each of these questions. I think that'd be neat. Sometimes I wish Paul were still around so I could write him a few questions. I think I might like some answers to those questions. But really and truly, the answers that he would give, I think they're all here already. And so we've got to pay better attention to what's there. But in chapter 7, he's answering these questions, and it's like listening to one side of a conversation. And so Andrea's on the telephone, and I'm kind of nosy, and I'm, okay, what is the other person saying, for her to give that answer? And she'll give me a look, that look about not paying so much attention to that. But this is important, but we don't have the Corinthians questions. And so it's difficult to reconstruct in some cases, although it's not that difficult because we have Paul's answers. And a careful study of Paul's answers pretty much yields what the questions would have been. And they may not have been worded exactly like this, but pretty much as you go through chapter 7, these are the big topics that they wanted answered. Is abstinence preferable to marriage? Should a single person stay single? Or is it okay to get married? The second line of questions, how about those married to pagan Gentiles? And then one of the two obeys the gospel of Christ, becomes a Christian. Do they have to split up in order to avoid contaminating the Christian side of that equation? You have cases in the Old Testament, for example, in Ezra, where people have married pagans, they married Gentiles, and against the law of Moses. And you read about some situations where marriages are unlawfully done, and therefore they address that. And you have Jews who determine to put away their Gentile spouses. And so that question comes up, does the same principle apply here? What about virgins and widows? Would it be better for them to remain as they are? Which is in some ways a restatement of the question at the beginning of the chapter, but with the added twist of not only young women, but how about older women who have been married before and their husbands have died? What then? And so one by one, Paul takes up these questions. And in the first instance, is abstinence preferable? Does a person have to stay single? And this is how Paul deals with that, verses 1 through 11. Now concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, literally not to touch a woman or embrace a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Okay. And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not going to answer all the questions that you have about this chapter. I'm not even going to answer all the questions I have about this chapter, but I am going to look at the broad overview. And the broad overview in this case is this, that marriage has its place. One can argue that under certain circumstances, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And it's especially not good outside of holy matrimony. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband, and it flows both ways. It's not that each woman has a husband and a man has more than one wife. No. Her own husband, his own wife. You have God's design for marriage all the way back in Genesis 2 reiterated here. One man, one woman bound together by God for life. And that's a good thing. It's not good for a man to be alone. And so God makes a helper suitable for him in Genesis 2, takes of his side, his rib, and behold, woman. And it's a beautiful picture in Genesis chapter 2. And as a consequence of that, it is better to get married than to commit sexual sin or to burn with lust. Paul reiterates that in verse 9 after stating it in verse 2. Because of the temptations that exist, the sexual urges, it's better to satisfy them within the framework of marriage than to lose control and to allow Satan to get the upper hand. And once that marriage is consummated, husband and wife have this beautiful relationship with blessings and obligations toward one another. And those obligations are to be fulfilled unless by mutual agreement for a time and devoting yourselves to prayer during that moment of separation and come together again as husband and wife, lest Satan tempt you. And so again, do not deprive one another is the admonition there. And all of this in keeping with Jesus' teaching, if there is to be a separation, and sometimes in this broken world in which we live, things don't always work out according to our fairy tale expectations. In this broken world in which we live, if there is to be a separation or a divorce, he says, not I, but the Lord. Jesus has already addressed this. And Jesus has already addressed this in passages such as Luke 16:18, Mark 10, 1 through 12, Matthew 19, 3 through 9. And the bottom line of what Jesus has taught is that in the very beginning, God brought two people together and blessed this holy matrimony union so that they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Matthew 19, verse 6. Matthew 19, verse 9. Whoever divorces his wife, except for the cause of fornication, and marries another, commits adultery. He basically taught the same thing in Matthew 5, 31 and 32, that you have heard that it has been said, whoever divorces or his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Whoever puts away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for the cause of fornication causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So what Jesus had taught, and again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you look at Matthew 5, 31, 32, look at Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, Luke chapter 16, verse 18. What Jesus had taught in a world, a Jewish world, in which men had a lot of sway over women. Women were held to a high standard, and men pretty much could divorce and remarry at a whim, but women were expected to be faithful to the husband. Jesus evens the scales, rather than evening the scales by saying that the men are living in the mud and the women are held to a high standard, so we'll kind of equalize things by allowing both to live in the dregs. No, we'll go back to the beginning intentions of God for both sides of this equation. You get married, you stay married, you work things out, you love your wife, you love your husband. And if things break down to the point that you go your separate way, you don't go your separate way with the idea of marrying a third party that makes matters even worse. You remain unmarried, or you become reconciled to your rightful spouse. Marriage is for keeps until death do you part. And you don't have a throwaway, disposable attitude toward a holy marriage covenant. So that's Paul's basic answer. Again, there are details that we could look at up close and personal, but that's the overall picture. Well, what about marriages to non-Christians? And so you have in verse 12 beginning, to the rest say I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so unpacking this is a little more complicated. We could spend hours on this, but again, the bottom line, this is something that in which Paul throws a new wrinkle. And it's something that we all should think about. The Christian sanctity rubs off. That a Christian is so blessed by God under the new covenant. And the Christian's influence, therefore, should reflect all of these tremendous blessings. That you can have a Christian home. Let's say that you're a wife in first century Corinth, married to a pagan husband. You obey the gospel of Christ, and your husband does not. Should you leave him? No. You can still have a Christian home. your blessedness of being a Christian rubs off on him. That, the idea of him being holy is not that all of a sudden he gets into heaven on your coattails. That's not what Paul is saying. What he is saying is, well, it kind of harkens back to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there was this idea, and it was prevalent, and it was the idea that carried the day in the Old Testament period, that whenever you put something holy next to something unholy, whenever you put something clean next to something unclean, whatever is unclean or unholy contaminates whatever it is that's holy. Haggai chapter 2, for example, beginning with verse 11, thus says the Lord of hosts, ask the priest about the law. If someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? The priest answered and said, no. Then Haggai said, if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? The priest answered and said, it does become unclean. Then Haggai answered and said, so it is with this people and with this nation before me, declares the Lord, and so with every work of their hands, what they offer there is unclean. So you have a contamination of the spread of unholiness and uncleanness. You put something holy with something unclean, and everything becomes spoiled. What Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, and this is wild, I want you to think about this. It's the exact opposite. This Christian woman is married to this guy who worships at the temple of Apollo. Does she need to leave him? No. She is so blessed by God as a Christian now that her holiness extends to every nook and cranny of that home, that it even touches him. Again, he's not saying that he's saved. But Paul is saying that because of her holiness, it rubs off on her husband, and the entire home is holy. The children are holy. The entire home is holy because she's in it. Now, that's a wild concept to chew on. And what it does is it forces us to think that under the gospel, things are different than they were in Haggai's time. That the holiness overpowers the unholiness and not vice versa, as in Haggai's illustration. That you are so blessed and set apart by God, consecrated by God, that even your husband that you were already married to is now going to be touched by that and affected and impacted by that. And it's going to rub off on your children. You're going to have a Christian home, even if the husband stays pagan. Hopefully, eventually, he'll come around. And you have that idea elsewhere in 1 Peter chapter 3, that even without a word, the woman wins her husband by her good example. And that would often happen. Her influence is so powerful that it touches him, and eventually he comes around totally and completely. That's what happens. Which raises this issue. It's hard for a holy person who lives for Jesus Christ not to be a person of influence. Especially in the home. Your influence as a Christian touches every part of your home because you're in it and Jesus has impacted you, and therefore that kind of rubs off as salt and light in that home. It's a wild idea, but chew on that. See if that doesn't make some sense. You can still have a Christian home. Timothy had a Gentile father, a Greek, presumably unbeliever, but he had Lois and he had Eunice, godly grandmother, godly mother, and their faith became his faith. Even if the father wasn't necessarily on board with all that, the power of the influence of Lois and Eunice on little Timothy made a believer out of him. And so don't give up. If you obey the gospel, your spouse doesn't obey the gospel, you still have tremendous power of influence if you're connected to the vine, Jesus Christ. You're one of those branches that is being nourished by that vine. It's going to produce these marvelous grapes, fruit of the Spirit, and touch other people in your life. But there are times when that husband doesn't like the fact that his wife is a Christian, or the wife doesn't like the fact that her husband's a Christian. And in a pagan culture, those are difficult equations. And it may be that there's an edict that says, unless you go with me to the temple of Apollo and start being an Apollo worshiper, we're done. And you know what the Christian says in that situation? You know, honey, I don't want that to happen. And I want to be a good spouse. But I want you to know that Jesus Christ comes first. And if that's what it's going to come down to, I hate to see you go, but you're going to have to go. My allegiance is going to stay with Jesus. Now, that was unheard of in many respects in this culture, which Paul was writing. You're not his slave. You're not under bondage to him in such a way that, now you can be in submission to him in matters subject to human judgment. That's what 1 Peter 3 suggests, commands. But you're not his slave. God has called you to peace. That's a covenant word. You have a covenant relationship with Jesus Christ that trumps all the other relationships. And if he's going to leave you over that, okay. You put Christ first. The issue, the main question is not, or is whether separation is mandatory, and the answer is no. But regardless, whatever happens, you put Jesus first. Then he gives two illustrations, circumcision and slavery, and we're running out of time here, so well, I'll go ahead and read it real quickly here. Beginning with verse 17, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, therefore let him remain with God. And the whole point behind all this is, okay, you're a slave before you're Christian. That doesn't mean that you're not a slave the moment you rise out of the waters of baptistry. You're free before you became a Christian. That doesn't mean you're a slave to any human being after you become a Christian. You're circumcised before, you're still circumcised afterwards, uncircumcised and so on. Married beforehand, you're still married the moment after. Married to a non-Christian beforehand, you're still married to that non-Christian after. And you make the best of it. Life is sometimes messy. I wish it were neat and tidy, but it's sometimes messy. And sometimes one spouse obeys the gospel, the other one doesn't. And okay, but you remain in the condition in which you're called. But the most important part of your identity at that point is not circumcised or uncircumcised or slave or free or even married or unmarried. The most important part of your identity at that moment forward is Christian. That's it. And you have to remember that at all times. Okay. What about virgins and widows? Should they remain unmarried? And Paul goes on to say, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who is by the Lord's mercy trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Then down in verse 32, he says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit, but the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, if it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and he has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. Now, all of this counsel takes under consideration the idea that unmarried females betrothed in marriage were already bound to their fiancés, and it's morally acceptable to consummate that betrothal. There are times when the whole thing may be loosed or dissolved, but it's okay to consummate. It's morally right to do so. However, there is a present distress that Paul mentions. We don't know exactly what was going on. I suspect the onset of difficult times where a stable family life was not always possible. And under that kind of circumstance, you might want to give it a second thought before diving into marriage. During times of uncertainty, times in which one of you might die for the faith, times in which your whole life might be subject to upheaval, it's morally okay to get married, but it's not necessarily advisable in a time like that. And there evidently was a time like that at the moment Paul is writing this. And so he says a lot to say this, essentially, that yes, it's morally acceptable, but not necessarily advisable. Marriage in such circumstances is allowable, but think twice. How about widows? Verses 39 and 40. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. In other words, this is divine common sense, or divine wisdom of judgment. So again, the same advice to widows as to young ladies who have never been married. It's okay to get married, but think about the ramifications of what you're doing, particularly during a difficult time, and only in the Lord. I don't want to beat that one to death. My personal opinion, I'll state, is that he's saying to marry a Christian, but you can make a case. You could make a case that what he's saying here is in keeping with the principles of marriage that the Lord has taught in the pages of the New Testament, the principles of the gospel. You can make that case, not necessarily limiting this to a Christian, but my opinion is that he's saying, and we could talk about that over a coffee table maybe, but be that as it may, it's okay for a widow to marry, but only in the Lord, and she should weigh this carefully before she dives in. All right. So that's essentially what Paul says about marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. Covered a lot of territory, but maybe didn't cover all the controversial points that you may have wanted me to cover. But the bottom line, marriage is a God-given earthly blessing. It's optional. You don't have to do it. And it's often fraught with challenges in a wicked world. Weigh those very carefully. And if you marry, God's will is supreme, not the spouse, but the Lord. And God-given wisdom should also be mustered and considered every step of the way, including before you enter into that covenant relationship. And in the bigger scheme of things, married or not married, serving God faithfully is the most important thing in your life. Never lose sight of that. Marriage doesn't change that. It may enhance it, may not. But serving the Lord is the most important thing in your life. And that has eternal implications. Okay, I'm done. If you're subject to the invitation call of Jesus Christ, we want to serve you, and you could become a Christian, part of the bride of Christ, his church, being baptized into him, and allow him to sanctify you with the washing of water, with the word. Great blessing to become part of Christ's bride, the church, and to have that relationship with God through him. Let's stand and sing a song of invitation.